Thank you everyone for joining today. Honoured and privileged to have Holly Lawrence joining us to open up and discuss her nutrition journey. This promises to be, I think, a very insightful talk and hopefully a lot of practical takeaways for every athlete out there about what Holly does on a day-to-day basis around her habitual nutrition, but also her sort of performance nutrition and certainly her race nutrition. In terms of the way that we'll structure today's call, I think I have everyone on mute at this point in time. And so what we'll do is, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat feature. We will go through the talk that Holly and I sort of have prepared, but it is very loosely prepared, and it's going to be very just colloquial and social chat. And then at the end of the talk, we will aim to get through all the questions, and hopefully during the talk, we'll answer a lot of those questions as we go. I think that's probably about it for housekeeping. I think just to get things going, I'll get Holly to introduce herself. I know a lot of you already know who Holly is, but I think it's a good reminder of who Holly is and what she's done.
Yeah, so I'm Holly. I'm a professional triathlete. I focus on the 70.3 half Ironman distance triathlon racing. And yeah, I've been working with Scott and Fuelin now for about 6 months, maybe a bit over that now. Kind of reached out as just kind of wanting to cover my bases. Kind of really thought that I was kind of really nailing nutrition. So it was kind of something that I entered thinking, oh, it's just going to reinforce what I am doing. I'm pretty knowledgeable in the area, did a sports science degree in university, and kind of got my eyes opened a little bit of how much better I could have been fueling, and just, yeah, it's really changed the game with me now.
Yeah, so Holly, I mean, oh, and just so everyone knows, my name is Scott Tindal. I'm one of the co-founders and one of the performance nutrition coaches for Fuelin. Fuelin is the world's first training-based nutrition app. So it syncs directly with your training program. So if you're on Training Peaks, Today's Plan or Final Surge, then we link in or sync directly with that so that you have personalized nutrition program that actually fits your training program. So Holly, I think let's go back a little bit. What were your initial sort of nutrition beliefs? I mean, you won 70.3 world championships. You weren't doing things badly.
Yeah.
You know, what were your initial beliefs, and what had you been doing prior to what we started doing?
Yeah, so I think when it came to actually like in race nutrition, I thought that I was like nailing, like I was eating probably like 80 grams of carbs an hour. And I know that it was at the time as well, a lot more than most of the other female athletes that I was racing against. But then when it came to training, I was kind of way more restrictive, kind of felt that I had to limit carbs more, like around, I could fuel around training, but felt like for me specifically with body composition, as it's always a hot topic, I felt like I had to kind of be more restrictive because that was just me, that I felt like I was maybe more insulin resistant, and there's just things that I'd kind of picked up on the way. And I was actually speaking to a friend the other day about this, and I feel like with nutrition, I now feel like the same way as why I would have a coach is because like I could probably coach myself because, you know, I've been doing it long enough. I know the basics, but then you kind of lose that perspective when you're coaching. If you were coaching yourself, that you'd probably be overtraining, you know, you're kind of overthinking everything. And that's kind of what I was doing with nutrition.
It's funny that, isn't it? Because I think someone in your scenario or your situation probably does have the knowledge even to coach themselves physically. Mm-hmm. But if you went and did that, you could, as you say, lose sight. And sometimes having that third person just helping you along can be instrumental to actually improving your performance. And it also potentially takes off some of the pressure where you go, okay, well, obviously you question what we do, but it's also like it takes away a little bit of that decision paralysis, and you ultimately just look at the program and go, okay, well, this is what I need to be doing. In terms of, you mentioned a couple of things there about insulin resistant and maybe some of these beliefs around carbohydrates. Where did they come from?
I mean, just kind of over time. I used Super Sapiens patch for a little bit, measuring blood glucose, and you see, spikes and crashes. And then I just I think falling into the trap of what most athletes do, that during race season, really caring about body composition, and then just kind of taking a restrictive approach, and like you're just being harsher with yourself, as opposed to someone being a lot more logical, a lot more, zoned out perspective of it. So
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned like a blood glucose monitor. Did you find that useful for your day-to-day or your performance, or did you actually find that psychologically it sort of dampened your enthusiasm around carbohydrates?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, seeing it, like even if I were to eat like half an apple, I would see, a massive spike and a massive crash. So I was like, oh my God, I'm diabetic. Like, if the only way I would win my blood glucose would be like not eating carbohydrates. So if anything, it was like positively reinforcing the wrong thing.
Or negatively reinforcing.
Well,
yeah, no. And I think it's, I've written some articles on CGMs, and more recently written something about CGMs and maybe athlete behavior. And whilst I don't necessarily think they're terrible, I think there could potentially be some improvement in maybe education around what those spikes mean, and they're completely normal. Like you eating an apple and seeing a rise in interstitial blood glucose or interstitial glucose going up, that's the normal response. And I think maybe you understanding that, and again, for most, you're better educated than most, but that fear factor around carbohydrates can certainly be real. Was there anything else in terms of your background around testing or anything like that had made you fearful of carbohydrates? Or was there any behaviors that maybe people had reinforced?
Yeah, it was more just like a learned thing that if I restricted carbohydrates, if I felt like that was the only way that I knew that I could like manipulate my body composition. But then over time of doing that, then it's not having the same effect, and you just restrict.
And I know you talked about this recently on how they train. What were some of the negative consequences of you restricting carbohydrates during that period of time?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I've, restricted, like there was a time back in 2017, which I talked about when I had an injury and I was running on Alter G, and 10% less of my body weight, my foot didn't hurt. So it just clicked in me that I was like, okay, I'll lose 10% of my body weight, and did, but was failing bike workouts, failing, it was terrible in my swim workouts and everything else. And it looked lean, but I just wasn't performing, and it had, really detrimental kind of consequences, and probably no surprise that I got injured the year after.
Yeah. And I think, look, and that story it's not one amongst few, it's one amongst many that we hear consistently. So certainly at Fuelin, where not just females, but males as well, who potentially go down that route of restricting to reduce body weight. And you don't have to do it just purely through restricting carbohydrates, although it's generally the easiest way. It does end up having some of these dire consequences. So in terms of where we went then, if we look at the strategic areas that we sort of assessed early on, what, from your perspective, what were some of the areas where you felt, okay, that was insightful, or that was an area where you were unaware of? Was it things around maybe your dietary, just habitual sort of food habits? You talked about carbohydrates, but what sort of insights did you get from even just that human to human discussion about what you were doing from early on?
Yeah, I mean, the minute that we started working together, it was really like having an amount based on what my like requirements were, and how vastly different that was to what I was doing before. And if anything, I just wish I'd actually kind of measured as I do now back then, to like have a comparison of just like, you know, day-to-day diet, because that's the nice thing, at least with fueling, you can see like your fueling, you know, taking out of your like in workout fueling. So like you could make a direct comparison, and I'm sure it would be vastly different.
I mean, because you did say to me, I remember early on in one day, you made the comment to me, which sort of caught me off guard. You were like, wow, maybe for my entire career, I've been under fueling. And it was like, wow. And you still were performing very, very well. And so it does, you know, I think there is that sort of paradigm of, you know, what is under fueling, what is over fueling, and what sits in between for the individual athlete, and how can they perform very well. I mean, if we get into the nitty gritty of what we did early on in terms of assessment, so certainly we looked at some blood markers with you. And I know I've talked about this. I do want to emphasize for athletes out there that blood markers aren't the be all end all. I think you recognize that as well. They're an objective marker for a point in time that can be useful to identify certain health and performance aspects. Inside Tracker has been very good to you, I think, in terms of supporting that continual assessment. We do use Inside Tracker at Fuelin purely from a visualization for athletes, and I find it very useful as a practitioner to be able to show you and you to be able to visualize sort of trends over time. So not a single point, but certainly over time. And for Holly, she does get repeated sort of testing done, and it's not always possible for everybody due to sometimes to cost or budget restrictions. But for Holly, we do test fairly frequently. I would say somewhere between every 8 and 12 weeks. That has been done. Certainly an area where we do a full blood count a full blood panel for Fuelin athletes that we do recommend. And I think, again, in Holly's case, we should emphasize that it wasn't all doom and gloom. She was in very good health. So if we looked at her vitamin D, which is very rare for an athlete in the Northern Hemisphere to have very good vitamin D, but she was certainly on point. So she had a amount of vitamin D, which is sort of optimal or viewed as optimal for an athlete at 70 milligrams per deciliter, which is, again, probably credit to whether some previous advice or certainly her own intuition and knowledge about using vitamin D supplementation during those winter months. So she was taking 10,000 IU roughly 5 times a week, so getting through around 50,000 IU of vitamin D throughout those winter months, and that kept her level there, and we monitored her vitamin D level. Her red blood cell magnesium was excellent. We put this down to eating a lot of leafy greens, a lot of vegetables, which was already in her diet. And then she does also supplement with a magnesium supplement. Her HbA1c, which is a measure of glucose over time, so 90 days of glucose attached to hemoglobin, which is a very good indicator for health in relation to non-communicable type diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and cognitive decline. Her HbA1c was at 4.1%, and that's been consistently low. And what's really nice about that is that stayed consistently low despite the massive increase in carbohydrate consumption, which I think has been really reassuring for Holly as well, where there's always concerns with athletes, not just Holly, but anytime an athlete starts consuming more and more carbohydrates in the forms of whole foods, but also in terms of processed and ultra processed foods during training, that there is the concern that blood sugars could go up. I think Holly's lipid profile is fantastic as well. Again, a measure of health. Her total cholesterol to HDL cholesterol was fantastic at less than 2. The biggest concern, and something that Holly had raised with me and that was known previously, was about her iron. And Holly, do you want to just go into sort of your history around iron and potentially iron deficiency, if you're open to that?
Yeah. yeah, ferritin's something I've always just had tested and kind of looked at, but back in January last year, I had it tested and it was 16, which under 60 is like deficient, and 16 is like terribly, terribly deficient. But that's where just having like markers on an inside tracker test and not having anybody to go through it, because I've always kind of supplemented iron in the past, and I think there was the standard recommendations to stop taking iron like 6 months before that. So I'd stopped taking it because my iron was high, but my ferritin was really low, which is obviously like, speaking to Scott, it's like, well, yeah, if you're taking iron supplements, your blood iron, total iron is going to be high, but if your ferritin's low, then you need to be supplementing. And so just having help with that has been, like what's to worry about, what's not to worry about. So, and just on your own, you kind of, you just feel like you're just trying and erroring. So, yeah, and I've just had kind of steadily improvements since last January, which is good. But I'm still in the deficient range, but like just nearly out of it.
No, you're not in the deficient range anymore. The deficiency is a little bit lower. You were in the deficient range when you were down at 16, and now you're getting up into the normal range now, which is really good. And I think just on that point, so the markers that we have looked at is ferritin, hemoglobin, and her transferrin saturation. And what has been really interesting is what Holly has been doing in terms of her supplementation routine. I think originally you were taking 65 milligrams of elemental iron.
Yeah.
And so we actually looked at doubling that at a point in time, and also trialing an alternate day supplementation routine. And that it's really interesting to see that despite increasing the amount of elemental iron she was doing, plus also looking at iron containing foods from an animal standpoint, but also a leafy or a plant standpoint, it has been a graded increase, hasn't it, Holly? Like, it hasn't been like, wow, okay, it's suddenly up. But what we can see over time is trending certainly in the right direction. And I think that's a really important point for athletes to understand, is that your change in your stored iron, ferritin, that's what ferritin is, your stored intramuscular iron, is it will take time. Okay, you probably won't see any meaningful change for a minimum of 8 weeks on a blood test, but it could take, 6 months in Holly's case to get up into that sort of, adequate / optimal area. And to be able to maintain that due to the training volume and the intensity that Holly is doing, she may require supplemental iron on top of iron containing foods for the period of time that she is in this training mode and competing at the level she is. And I think for female athletes who are menstruating female athletes, getting their iron panel checked, so i.e. ferritin, hemoglobin, and transferrin saturation, has been one really important marker that I think has made fairly significant improvements to Holly in terms of consistency in training, consistency in energy and mood and whatnot. And I don't know, I hope you agree with that, Holly.
Yeah, for sure.
In terms of that. So I think that's been really good. I think the other area which we looked at and Holly touched on was her body composition. And something we did early on was what's called a DEXA scan to really try and quantify, did Holly have a reason for trying potentially to reduce weight to a race weight where she felt comfortable at. And I think the question around race weight is always a tricky one, because I think the athlete, we should listen to athletes, because athletes will often know the answer to a lot of things that they're going through. But I think from my perspective, it was about trying to quantify that and show Holly actually she is extremely lean as an athlete, and potentially the drive to lose more weight maybe isn't required. And Holly, do you want to just touch on sort of what you found from the DEXA? I'm happy to go through the numbers if you want, or just from your perspective, what did you learn from the DEXA?
Yeah, it's more just, one, we realized that my bone density is really good. So that was kind of it's
amazing. and if you don't mind, you're okay. So
Yeah.
T-score is a measure that we look at for bone mineral density, and Holly's was 2.6. Anything greater than -1 is outstanding. Is good. Anything over 0 is outstanding. And for a female professional athlete who's been doing this sport for a long time, to have a bone mineral density like Holly's is a testament probably to the type of training she does, and probably over time, despite maybe some caloric restriction inadvertently through carbohydrate restriction, she has actually managed her health very well in that perspective. So I think that was really reassuring to see that your bone mineral density was very good, because unfortunately, as we've talked about on Fuelin multiple times and shared in social media, there is a very high proportion of triathletes and cyclists, female and male, who do unfortunately have low bone mineral density. So I think that was very good. That was a really positive finding.
Yeah. My body fat percentage is probably lower than I presumed it was, but then I think like we just lose that perspective when it's about yourself. You're super harsh on yourself. You always think, oh, I could lose a bit more, or extra that you're carrying. You're just so I just think just having someone else want to quantify it, and to keep you can check your lean mass and like muscle mass. That's something we've talked about that maybe we could bump up a little bit. But yeah, just someone else's kind of like solid grounded perspective. I could just think you kind of need, like I do, and in this kind of.
And I think it was good for you to actually see that you are very lean in that sense, and that there didn't need to be a drive to lose any more weight. And so then the focus shifted on actually fueling you correctly for your day-to-day nutrition and everything in and around your training, which I think for you was I think it was a big moment, because you were like, okay, I can really just focus on doing what I'm getting told to eat and really enjoy that. And that had a shift as well. I remember when you said like, oh, everything's back on the table now. And you commented, do you want to just talk about that? Like, I remember you mentioned something about carbohydrates to your family or something like that. And
yeah, I mean, just my family have known me forever, like dinner times, especially, that I would kind of be really light on carbohydrates. And, if I had a burger, it would be without a bun, or, I haven't eaten pasta for 10 years, or, bread. And now like I've eaten gluten-free, and luckily like the foods in the gluten-free department have got so much better in the last how many years. But yeah, they've been surprised that now I'm, eating more normally in their eyes anyway. So it's been nice. And yeah, I feel like it's been, I mean, my partner enjoys it more too, that I'm giving things. But yeah, I think it's just the confidence in being able to fuel more, and not having that worry that it's gonna like, I'm suddenly gonna, in a couple of weeks time, of not realize that I've gained 5 kilograms or something. I think that's normally just like the fear.
Yeah. And I think, like, touching on that, there was something that you highlighted to me early on, which I was actually, when we created the Fuelin program, where we separate in-session fueling from the daily nutrition. And I remember you made the comment, and you were like, oh, this is great, because now I can just, whatever you tell me to do in training, I don't sort of think about. I just look at the numbers and go, I've just got to fuel as much as I can to fuel the performance that I'm, getting pushed by my coaches for, and for yourself. And that was sort of a bit of an aha moment for me as well, to say, okay, this is great, because athletes can then just focus on actually fueling for the work that they're doing, and really just focusing on high performance when those carbs are required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I found it like, you're not seeing that I'm crushing 100 grams an hour for how many hours of my workout, and then it just looks that I'm like, already my daily intake is way more than I used to. So it's nice just to see that, and then whatever goes in a session is separate.
It's sort of separate in that. And do you want to talk about your carbs in training? Like, are you happy to touch on sort of what you are sort of hitting at the moment? I mean, I've got sort of the specific stats from what I've pulled from Fuelin, what you've entered, but From your perspective, if you want to break down like the bike and the run, like where are you? Do you know where you were at before and where you're at now specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there was that one time where we were kind of trying to find a limit, and
Yeah,
we kind of found out there is no limit.
exactly. You can eat a lot, and you're very lucky as a female athlete that you've got a pretty iron stomach actually. There's certainly commonalities between what I'm seeing in very high performing female athletes in particular is their ability to just not get the GI distress that so many unfortunate women do get in particular. But I mean, I think your peak has been well over 120 grams an hour, but you are averaging, close to around 100 grams an hour now, which has actually been a bump. I was looking back through your data that you entered in the carbohydrate testing, and that's been a bump of around 20 grams an hour as an average that you're now tolerating. And that's going to be beneficial to you. That extra 20 grams, what does that do to the body in terms of performance? I don't think we can honestly say, but if you've got that extra 20 grams of carbs in you, it should certainly help you on the bike. In terms of how you manage that carbohydrates on the bike, are you happy to talk about that? What types, what forms? So is it liquid, gels, chews, blocks, bars? What are you tending to favor?
I mean, that's something that we've obviously, spoken a lot about. We've tried different things, and kind of now I've settled on Morton drink mix and the mixture of the shot blocks on the bike, just because I like to chew things. And that's what I like, that, it's not just prescriptive, that I can kind of stick with what I like and I'm comfortable with. And as long as we've just practiced it a bunch, and you kind of make sure that like my sodium's in line and, everything else. But yeah, I mean, the plan, I've got a whole plan for my races, like individual races based on like the heat and whatever. But like right now, what is it that I'm going to try and get on in the bike? It's
you're at 120 grams an hour.
Yeah.
So your plan with the Morton drink and the Cliff blocks will put you at 120 grams an hour. And it's actually pretty manageable when you look at it. When you look at your plan, it's like 2 bottles and then I think 2 packets, and that's it on the bike. And, I think what you touched on there was a couple of really important points. Practice in training. You have done so much practice around what products you find are comfortable, what you like to consume in terms of palatability, not just from taste, but also texture. Because I know some athletes don't like Morton. They don't like the texture, but you enjoy the drink mix. You're very comfortable, as you said, with Cliff blocks and chewing them. Some athletes don't like chewing. They prefer just to swallow a gel. But it doesn't come from just pure luck. Like you've practiced that probably every week, at least once or twice a week for the past 6 months. And I think that's really important, not just for like a professional, but that applies to age groupers as well, is practicing their race nutrition on a weekly basis to get very comfortable with understanding what their race plan is going to be. It's not like some hypothetical, I don't give you a list and go, okay, this is what you're doing now at mile 5, mile 10. You know exactly what you're doing because you've practiced that week in, week out. And
it's not just practicing, just getting used to it so you're ready for the race, but it's been helping me get my bike sessions done. I've not failed a bike session yet. I've just feel like I've been talking to Flora Duffy. We're like, oh no way, the more carbs you eat during a session, like you actually train better and recover better. So yeah, it's been kind of good on all ends, and there's been no crazy consequences like I thought there would be.
And I mean, that point is really important takeaway as well for athletes, is like it helps your training. Like whatever your coach is giving you, or if you're coaching yourself, if you want to perform at your best, then give yourself energy to perform and produce that power. And I think like a lot of people will talk about Olaf Boo and the Norwegians and this like what they're doing. And it's like, no, what he's reinforcing is that you need to fuel the tank. You need fuel in the tank to produce the power. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're fueling yourself to do whatever it is you need to do. And you don't have to be a professional athlete to do that. You just need to recognize what your body requires and then do it regarding or related to the intensity of the session. And for you, like, I think it's also probably also important that when we do give you the high carbs, it's not every session, is it?
No, God, no.
So,
it's only been really like once a week.
yeah. And which sessions are those in for you?
It's just the high intensity session, which on a Thursday when I do it, it's like under and over threshold on the bike with some extra time, and then into a threshold run. So it's kind of the perfect sessions to be trialing it and kind of just practicing.
Yeah. And then on the lower intensity rides, what are you tending to use as fuel on those sessions just to keep the calories up? What do you tend to go towards?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I make rice cakes. I use Lara bars. Like, I kind of just use the, Fuelin recommendations. There's always like the lower carb, like for the just kind of low intensity ride options. So yeah.
You eat nuts and things like that on those rides?
Yeah, no, not nuts, but I mean, that if I had a Lara bar or something, then it's that kind of thing in it.
So you tend to go more for convenience foods that are just something you can grab and take with you on the bike. Do you ever eat sort of whole foods, like just for athletes out of interest? Do you ever eat bananas or anything like that on those rides?
Yeah, I eat bananas and make rice cakes. Like, I got a sushi rice and almond butter and jam that I make, and it's easy.
Yeah, and it's. I think the distinction there is there for your lower intensity, longer duration sort of sessions but you would never plan on racing with that fuel. Is that correct?
No.
No, but again, it's like important, I think, for athletes to understand that. I think what we have always tried to dissociate is like there's fueling for the purpose of fueling, and then there's fueling for the purpose of racing, and dialing in those two areas, I think, is important for athletes to understand as well. On the run, what I mean, at the moment, you're averaging around 96 grams an hour, which again has been a bump since we started of around 25 grams an hour. Now, it's not saying that you will necessarily require 96 grams an hour. We've trained above that sort of threshold, but what are you planning on using in the run?
Yeah, just trying, using Morton gels on the run, which is super convenient too, because that's what's going to be on course for Ironman races. And I just love the texture of them.
And we'll use the caffeinated ones as well in that point, just to give you the extra sort of 200 milligrams of caffeine as we go. And you don't have any issues with that? You tolerate those well, caffeine?
Yeah, I love them.
That's good. In terms of, I think that was mostly most of the talking points that we wanted to get through. I think, do you have anything else you wanted to add at this point in time, just about any takeaway messages or key takeaways for athletes before we get into some of the questions that some of the athletes might have?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the like my other training friends and pro athletes that I know have kind of been asking me what I've been doing the last 6 months or so with nutrition, and because I've kind of been raving about it, and they see me now with like a gel on poolside, or like drink mix in my bottle, which I would never have done for a swim. And and just that training's been going well for the last how many months, so they've all noticed the difference in me. And so it's just been a positive thing.
Oh, that's good. Can you see my screen? That one. Yep. Yeah. So what I thought I would do is just quickly, before we go into the questions, I just wanted to highlight what we do with Fuelin and what it is. On the left is some screenshots from Fuelin. So in this case, Training Peaks is directly synced with Fuelin. So every session that your coach provides you, or if you're writing your own programs, will be synced. And we use this traffic light system. Traffic light system, red is lower amounts of carbohydrates, not necessarily low. Yellow is moderate, and green is higher. So for someone like Holly or any of the other 600 athletes on the program, they can quickly see the program and quickly associate what the color means in relation to what the type of meal is. And then certainly the same thing for sessions. So when Holly sees a green light in the bike session, she knows that, okay, it's probably going to be higher carb fueling. I think the biggest pillar, the three pillars that we sit by, is that it's simple, it's personalized, and it's results driven. So a lot of that decision paralysis that Holly and I discussed, it's just allowing her to focus on doing what she does best, and that's training and then eating to provide, not just performance, but also health. So she can look at that plan and say, okay, I know what I need to eat, and I understand the amount of carbohydrates and the amount of macronutrients in it in order to allow me to thrive. It is, as we say, completely personalized to you. So the program that Holly gets is actually the same plan that anyone else would get, specific to their training program. Obviously, her training volume and training intensity might be a little bit different from, say, some other age groupers, but essentially the program is similar in terms of the pillars that sit behind it. It is very purpose driven. So, in Holly's case, it's all about performance at this point in time. We touched on removing sort of that need for improvements in body composition. And it's all about, driving health and driving performance for her. And then there is a lot of focus on data. We know that triathletes love data. So things like your carbohydrate capacity, your sweat rate testing. We didn't talk about your sweat rate, Holly, but that's fine. There's a lot of the ability where, we talk about partners or people that we work with, people like Precision Hydration and SOS Hydration, where they're pushing, athletes to understand what their hydration strategy are. And we certainly take that to a little bit of another degree and really dial that in for athletes. And there is a lot of this feedback loop as well. It works simply by downloading and then syncing your plan. Your coaches, can assist you with that in terms of just helping with the intensity score, the duration of the session, and the time of day can be then built into your program. As we said, there's a lot of testing within it, a lot of data, and the most important thing we find is that there is this engagement with the Fuelin community. So every week we hold a Q&A session around performance nutrition. We invite in other practitioners to talk. Recently we had Dr. Shannon O'Grady talking about creatine. Dr. Alan McCubbin has joined the Fuelin team and will be announcing that officially tomorrow. He's based at Monash University. He's been involved in some sweat and hydration discussions, and we look forward to having more discussions with him over time, and certainly other partners. And then for anyone, I know Tim from Training Peaks did ask a question about not everyone being able to afford a nutritionist, or maybe not the level of degree at which I work with people like Holly and other athletes, but certainly in terms of the program, for $29 a month, if they're on the annual program, you still can get the full program, and it does sync with your program, your coach's training program, and allow you to get the same level of service from a nutrition program that someone like Holly and many other professional athletes and excellent age group athletes have benefited from. So that's all I want to say about that. What we'll do is we can now go into some questions. I know there are a few there. So what have we got? We've got from Tim Robinson. He says, can you touch on scaling structured nutrition for athletes, coaches who may not be on Holly's level, or for someone who is coaching age groupers? Touch on scaling structured nutrition. Tim, are you there? Do you want to just explain that question? If you can unmute. I think what he's saying is, if you are a coach, can you utilize a nutrition program, or should they be trying to scale? I guess what we're trying to do at Fuelin is not be combative to coaches. What we're doing is actually complementing coaches, and we have a number of coaching organizations and teams that are now utilizing Fuelin so that we can actually reinforce the message around correct fueling for the athletes. So teams like Purple Patch Fitness, Valiant Endurance, Toro Performance, T0 Multi down in Australia, the Golden Gate Tri Club, Warringah Triathlon Club in Australia. they're now leaning on us to help their athletes and help their coaches reinforce those messages around nutrition, which isn't always easy for coaches to get across. And I think our view on this is coaches' primary role is to do the coaching around the athletics and reinforce the nutrition. Our primary role is to reinforce the nutrition and then support the training sort of focus. So I think if we can work more like a professional sporting model where we're not all in silos but actually working together, then I think athletes will certainly have a better outcome. And I think to Holly's point where she said, like, why try and do it all yourself when you can actually rely and have support from other people and maybe professionals who maybe know a little bit more and can actually guide you in that sense, then I think it's going to be a better outcome. And certainly that's what we're seeing when we're working with coaches and working with teams and working with athletes, is when there is that support network around them, that I think the outcome certainly is a lot better. So that's where I sort of go with that. 2 to 3 key pillars to athlete fueling that are applicable to athletes of all experience levels who maybe can't afford blood testing, hiring nutritionists. Well, I think firstly, $29 a month to have a truly personalized nutrition program is hopefully well within everyone's budget. I think certainly when people are spending upwards of $5,000 to $10,000 to $15,000 on a shiny new bike, sometimes focusing on the low-hanging fruit can certainly be of a lot of benefit. I think the pillars, exactly what Holly outlined, like, focus on fueling correctly. So, we didn't touch on protein, we didn't touch on fat actually, and but certainly Holly is eating a lot more protein. She's certainly on a high protein diet, which or a high protein amount, which I think is applicable to male, female athletes, younger and older. I think when we look at the science around protein and its importance for endurance athletes, certainly getting up over that 2 grams per kilo body weight, regardless if you're perimenopausal, menopausal, young, male, female, I think it certainly benefits everyone. And certainly we've seen that with Holly. So I think getting obviously carbohydrates in line with your training intensity, training volume, training load, high protein diet. And then they're probably the two key pillars, I think, around that. And then probably, as Holly said, eat during training. I think eating during training is certainly something not to shy away from. And I think you can slip into that slippery slope of thinking that if I don't eat in training, then I'm going to lose more weight and that's going to be better for me. But ultimately it just unravels after time. So do you have any other sort of key things, Holly, from your perspective that you would emphasize for athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say from my perspective, it's more being like checking off, because like I bet previously there was kind of a mismatch between the days where I needed more nutrition, like a bigger day of training where you're out all day and then you've not kind of compensated for it. And then say you've got recovery Monday the next day, and then you're eating more. So it's just having something that, I know exactly what I need to eat each day. I'm not having to think about it. I just, like, all athletes, we're very good once we've, got a plan that we trust and we believe in, to just hit that. And, I'm the same. And so it's just been key for me. So it's just kind of taking the guesswork out of it, which I feel like without it has been. And, besides having like an oxygen calorimeter on it the whole time, I honestly didn't think it was possible. It's either just trial and error. If your weight, after how many weeks of training is going down, then you're not eating enough, or it's going up, then you're eating too much. Like, I honestly thought it was that kind of rudimentary. So it's just been taking the guesswork out.
Oh, cool. Jordan asked, with Oceanside coming up next week, what's your nutrition plan leading into the event? Do you carb load, and how much? Yeah,
I mean, I don't even know when I just follow what my plan is. But, all the days are green.
She has a lot of green days, Jordan. technically speaking, her carb, the race is on Sunday, isn't it? I should say.
Okay.
Saturday.
Your Sunday.
It's my Sunday, sorry. So she will start taking in higher amounts of carbohydrates on the Thursday, and then her carbohydrate load, which will be over 8 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates, will be on that day before. And she has practiced that. She will practice that and has practiced that previously, because just for everyone out there, 8 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates, regardless of how your body size, it's all relative to your body size. So Holly is smaller, but that 8 grams per kilo body weight is still a lot for her to consume. And so it is important to practice that. And certainly if you're a heavier athlete, then 8 grams per kilo body weight becomes a lot more food, and it is all relative, and it's important to practice that. I think
it's good. It's timed out between, your workouts
Sure.
that you have. It's not like, you just have 400 grams of carbohydrates to eat and you pile it all in one go. It's like it's manageable. It doesn't even seem that much by the end of it, and it's actually enjoyable.
And that's a really good point to emphasize as well, is that when you look at your day, it is very much split over snack, breakfast, mid-morning snack, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, dinner, sort of dessert, just to top off. And, to your point, you manage that a lot easier because you're not just trying to cram in a big bowl of pasta at the end of the day, which, we know doesn't necessarily work in terms of total amounts of carbohydrates. So yeah, that's what she'll be doing. And I think we touched on her nutrition plan actually within the race. What hydration? So Marta Russell asked, what hydration is your go-to for the run? She likes malt and mix, but it always feels like a challenge trying to mix bottles during a race. We touched on what you're going to be consuming. How do you manage your hydration in the race? It's a bit different for pros because you can have stuff set out for you as well, I guess.
Yeah, we only have pro aid station on the run for world champ races, so we'll just be using on course and then just gels. So I won't actually be using malt and mix for the run. That'll just be the bike, so I'll just be using the gels and water on course.
And you just use water on course to stay hydrated.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, Marta, is just based around her sweat testing as well, and understanding how much fluid that Holly needs to consume during the run to keep herself in a state where she will lose some percentage of body weight, but it won't be detrimental to her performance. Sergio asks, hi Scott, Holly, what do you think about low carb diets? Yeah, I think, look, Sergio, from our perspective, we view carbohydrates as being very important. It's not to say that lower amounts of carbohydrates cannot be utilized by athletes at certain periods of time to reduce total caloric intake. Now, there's a difference between low carbohydrate and lower amounts of carbohydrate. We will classify lower amounts of carbohydrates as around 1.8 grams per kilo body weight. Okay. Now, technically speaking, for a low carbohydrate diet, that's going to be 50 grams or less of carbohydrates per day, which then would require a significant bump in fat to maintain total caloric intake and energy balance. Differing schools of thought. Certainly a low carbohydrate, high fat diet can increase fat oxidation. That's the ability to utilize body fat as a fuel source. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lose body fat. In order to lose body fat, you still need to be in a caloric deficit. By taking in more fat, you have the ability to put on more fat through, if you are taking in excessive calories, it can be detrimental to your ability to use carbohydrates at higher intensities. So I think if you are going to go down the route of a lower carbohydrate, high fat diet, it should be supervised, it should be structured, it should be timed in terms of your training sort of schedule and your race schedule. We don't tend to do low carbohydrate diets at Fuelin. We tend to use carbohydrates for, as Holly sort of highlighted during the talk, about for the fuel required. And when she is training at high intensity, high volume, we use a lot of carbohydrates to do that. And that has had the positive impact of improved sleep, improved mood, improved recovery, improved outcomes in terms of training, repeatability as well. And, you know, that's not just coming from me, that's coming from chatting with her coach about consistency, and also from Holly herself, which again is usually a good measure. When the athletes saying positive things about their training and how they're actually performing, then I'll usually take that subjective well-being score as something very, very positive. Holly, low carb diets for you?
What's that?
Low carb diets for you?
No. I think I'm done. I mean, it has a time and place just to have like a day that you're not hammering carbs, and like, you know, it's not, I think if maybe, you know, Sergio thinks that every day is a high carb day. That's not, it's based definitely around my training and, you know.
And your carbohydrates, just to emphasize as well, like you eat a lot of vegetables as forms of carbohydrates. And I think sometimes everyone just, I think, associates carbohydrates with rice, pasta, gels, blocks, liquid carbs. But, you know, you're eating, you know, 6-7 serves of vegetables a day. You eat potatoes, sweet potatoes, grains, different forms, pulses, things like that. Like, carbohydrates come in many forms. And I think, again, it's not that on those lower carbohydrate days, she's still eating carbohydrates, but probably more in certainly a more complex form, whole food form, in that she just utilizes maybe the ultra processed or processed carbohydrates for in session high intensity fueling in that sense. Ed asked, hi Scott, forgive me if I missed it, but do you include creatine as part of Holly's supplementation regime? Holly?
Yes, I do. That's something I started as soon as we started working together. I take 1 scoop, 5 grams. It's 5 grams? Yeah, a day.
5 grams,
and yeah, I mean, I've had no negative side effects from it, but it's, you know, there's more and more research on it. You know, Scott, you'll be able to tell more than me. But there's always been this, like, you know, connotation that it's for weightlifters, and, you know, that you can increase your water weight. So I've always kind of been like, oh yeah, that's not for me. So yeah.
And I mean, you nailed it. I mean, 5 grams a day, chronic. Ed did ask whether it's on a continuous basis or a targeted regime, and ultimately, no, Ed, it's like just take 5 grams a day, and that will saturate your muscle creatine content over about somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. Certainly, if you are going to start taking creatine and you have a race coming up in a shorter period of time than, say, 4 weeks, there could be the argument to maybe double the dose or do creatine loading. The argument against that, maybe for an endurance athlete, which is what Holly touched on, is the potential to put on a little bit of water weight due to that creatine loading. And so that's probably got to be tossed up. So what I would say is just at the start of off season, start taking it regularly, 5 grams a day. And then any of that unintended water gain usually levels out over time. And that's been shown in the research as well. Sergio asked, is it possible to lose weight and have a good performance in training? What do you think, Holly?
Yeah, I mean, when we were working around our races, and that's one thing in Fuelin that you kind of didn't mention, that, you know, you have your weight, you're always weighing in. I would say not always, but like you have the option. It reminds you every Friday or whatever day it is. And I have Garmin scales that it just like automatically syncs with Training Peaks and Fuelin anyway. So it's always like updating that. And then you have like a goal weight, which, you know, that's something that we can discuss. There's times where you kind of maybe a focus, but during races, and especially to like world champs of the year, I always want to be like at my race weight or whatever, that where it just deems that I'm, you know, not carrying anything extra than I need, but keep it in line with what's safe and what's going to make me perform well. So yeah, that's why it's nice to have someone else kind of, you know, monitoring that with me.
And I think, like we've always said, like there are going to be times where you're trying to, you know, get to a particular weight based around racing, but it's not holding that weight for the entire year. Like you have your sort of potential where you normally fit and maybe where you want to be for racing, and that's the fluctuations throughout the year, and that's, you know, periodizing total calorie intake as well based around your training. So I think for Sergio, it's definitely harder to lose weight and have good performance. And I think for simplicity reasons, we would stress to athletes that if your focus is on losing weight, accept that some of your performance might go down. There are cases, though, that in order to lose weight, you have to be in a caloric deficit. Therefore, the amount or the degree of caloric deficit is probably going to have the biggest impact on your ability to perform. So if you're in a relatively small caloric deficit, you could still lose weight and perform relatively well. However, if you're trying to lose weight, you're taking in 1,000 calories a day and trying to exercise, your performance is going to suck. And so I think it is important to strike that balance. It is important for you as an athlete to recognize if you are in a caloric deficit, the performance is probably not going to be as optimal as if you're certainly in a caloric surplus or at least in an isocaloric state. It's important to talk to your coach or your trainer about how you're feeling if you are in a caloric deficit and you're trying to train. I think most importantly is when you come to a certain period of time out from a race, don't try and lose weight. Just accept that's where you are. Probably somewhere between 4 and 2 weeks before a race. You certainly don't want to be losing any more weight and just focusing on actually feeling really good. That's how I would certainly approach it, and that's how Fuelin approaches it. Pat said, I just started omega-3 fish oil. It seems to help with strength and recovery from minor muscle injuries. Is this normal or is it due to something else? What do you think of omega-3s? We didn't touch on omega-3s. Omega-3s, I think, is something very interesting from a health and potentially a performance standpoint. We do recommend athletes get what's called an omega quant test done. I think Holly's probably writing, damn, I need to get that done. So you did get your omega quant. Yeah, you did get it done. Sorry. So the omega quant test is super interesting. It will provide you with what's called an omega index. That level should be somewhere between 8 and 12% for health reasons, and there are some links to performance, but certainly in terms of its relationship to, say, cognitive decline, to cardiovascular disease, to diabetes, there is a lot of correlation there, not necessarily causation, but fairly significant correlation. So I will lean on that and say that it is one test that is certainly actionable for athletes to be able to bring about change. I know that I saw a couple of athletes on this call that certainly have done the omega quant test and have certainly changed their habitual intake of small oily fish, things like sardines and herring and mackerel. It's not for everyone. I certainly love it. But if you're not doing that, then certainly taking omega-3s somewhere in that 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams of EPA DHA is what we recommend. If you are on blood thinners, though, certainly speak to your doctor about that, because there is high levels of omega-3s can cause thinning of the blood. And so we obviously don't want any issues with that. But there is evidence to show that it can reduce muscle soreness. There is some evidence to suggest that high dose omega-3s can improve strength. It's not unequivocal, though. There is sort of conflicting data around strength. But I think in terms of health markers around cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, then certainly it's one of those supplements that I sort of put in the line of creatine, of sort of like, why wouldn't you be supplementing with an omega-3 if you're looking at, for most athletes, you got into sport to be healthy. So look at supplements, not just from a high performance standpoint, but also look at them from a health perspective. And things like creatine, yes, it can improve sprint performance, power, muscle, all those cool things, but potentially it might help with cognitive decline and brain health and I think that's overall, that's going to be a positive thing, maintaining lean muscle mass, and then omega-3s could do a similar thing. So I'd certainly say stay on that. Who's that? When we wrap up, please give a big thank you to Tim and Training Peaks. Yes, we'll do that. Do your plans take women's menstrual cycles into consideration? Nutrition can be a little bit more challenging depending on the time of the month. This is from Valerie. I'll just answer this, and Holly, you can put your perspective in. So previously, when I first started this program, we did actually play around with a little bit of structuring the nutrition around the female menstrual cycle, because, as you know, there is some evidence to show that women in the late luteal phase will be better with higher amounts of fat and reduced carbohydrates. But most of the research there is actually looking at their ability to cope with higher intensity exercise versus lower intensity exercise. So my argument here, rather than the nutrition program being built around the women's cycle, I would actually say that it's either on the athlete or the coach, in terms of, if you want to go down that route, that the structure of the training program should be built around the female cycle. And then us as nutritionists or dietitians, and certainly Fuelin, would then support the type of training being prescribed to the athlete. So in Holly's case, if at the start of her cycle, in that follicular phase, she was provided with lots of high intensity training and all that, she would obviously be fueled appropriately with higher amounts of carbohydrates, moderate amounts of fat, and so on, and high protein. If the training was then structured so that her luteal phase was taken into account, she would therefore be given more Z1, Z2 training to sort of sit around that training. We would then fuel that Z1, Z2 training appropriately with higher amounts of fat, lower amounts of carbs. But if she was given high intensity training in the luteal phase and we supplied her with higher amounts of fat, lower amounts of carbs, it sucks. It just doesn't work. So you've got to look at what training is being given first and foremost, and then support that with nutrition, as opposed to trying to work with nutrition on top of whatever the training is. That's certainly what we're seeing in the evidence. And when you look through the research around giving women higher amounts of carbs and them doing high intensity training in the luteal phase, there is, from a practical standpoint, no difference, despite what some marketing might say. Holly, how do you feel about, like, we've never done that with you. We've never done around your cycle. So
it's like, before I was looking for any information and kind of taking on way too much information. And that's part of being, I read, Stacey Sims books and trying to adapt everything to me, but it was kind of just overwhelm of information. And then you end up kind of losing sight of what you're actually doing. So if anything, I just think I'm fueling better generally, so that I don't even, it's just not an issue with me around my cycle. And, I don't have a crazy, that I can't train and various times. I don't have to adjust my training schedule. So maybe I'm lucky that way. But if anything, just fueling generally better has put me in a better spot anyway.
And your point there, I think women, there's so much individuality with women and how they respond to a menstrual cycle. Now, I'm certainly not a woman, and I can't begin to understand what a female goes through depending on how they respond to the menstrual cycle. But I think if you are an athlete that really does struggle, and, as Holly said, thankfully she doesn't struggle with this, and whether that's a coincidence with the fueling that we do or not, but if you are a female that struggles in that late phase with high intensity training, then potentially look at what training you're doing, structure your training around your cycle, and then get the nutrition to support that training. And we could certainly do that, because the intensity of the training will be dictated in the training program in Training Peaks, and we would supply you with the appropriate amounts of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins to support that. So that's sort of my view on it. Look, and I just think there's more research to come with that. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be compelling evidence to say that if you do follow that type of fueling, that you will perform any better. You may feel better, but you certainly may not perform any better in an athletic capacity. So I think, like most things to do with women and sports nutrition and performance, we just need more research done. And I think if there are women athletes out there who are willing to participate in research, then I would wholeheartedly support it and encourage you to get involved in research. Groups like Faster certainly are pushing this and certainly have a lot of really interesting studies being in progress, and hopefully more research will come out of that. That's good, Vicky. Thank you. Vicky said that she's willing to be included in research. So yeah, certainly reach out to groups like Faster and that. I think that you can certainly get a lot out of that. I think that's, oh no, sorry, a couple more questions. Is it optimal to fuel before every session if possible, regardless of intensity? It's always a controversial one. You don't have to fuel before every session. Certainly if the duration is less than 60 minutes and it's low intensity, I don't think you have to fuel beforehand. You're not going to suddenly drop dead or anything like that. Total calories throughout the day, total protein intake, total carbs, total fat throughout the rest of the day is probably going to be just as important in terms of how you respond to that. Certainly fueling post-session is going to be of utmost importance. Don't do a session fasted after an overnight fast and then wait until 1 o'clock. That would not be necessarily the best thing to do. Holly, you do some training fasted?
Yeah, just every now and again, more of like, I just like, that's something we've talked about, whether it's necessary. I used to do a lot fasted, but yeah, just every now
you
and
enjoy
again,
it.
easy
You like it.
Yeah,
exactly. You enjoy going and doing a 30 or 45-minute run without eating beforehand, and it's fine. I don't view that as detrimental to your health. I certainly don't view it as detrimental, or I also don't view it necessarily as being amazingly beneficial to your performance, but psychologically it's something you enjoy, then I don't think there's any reason to stop doing that. So
yeah, I think as long as you're not doing it, for a reason that's just like, correct, I'm doing it to restrict, then I think
exactly
slippery slope. But
no, look, I know we've gone a little bit over time, but first and foremost, I'd like to thank the team from Training Peaks, Tim and Paul, for helping put this on and arrange it. Fantastic. And as we've said, Fuelin syncs directly with Training Peaks. And if you are on Training Peaks and you have a coaching plan, certainly look at how we integrate with Training Peaks, because it's a seamless integration, and the team at Training Peaks are an incredible team. I think they're producing a platform that is outstanding for athletes, and it continues to improve all the time. Their education pieces, the pieces that they get trainers and dietitians and coaches to write on their platform is outstanding, and we can't thank them enough for putting on today. And then probably most importantly, Holly, I know your time is completely invaluable, and you giving up an hour of your time so close to Oceanside is amazing, and I'd like to thank you very much for generously giving up your time for everyone to hear about what you're doing on a daily basis.
Well, thank you, but I think you're more. Yeah.
No. So thank you everyone for tuning in. This will be recorded. We will post it on YouTube, and we will send it out to everyone who registered. So thank you, and we'll see. Good night for you, and it's a good afternoon for me in Australia. So cool, thank you.
That's fun.
Thanks, Holly.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.